got a call from uh, the Florence family. They were back from New Guinea for the birth of their child. He called me and he said, I'd like to come by. And we've got a couple other missionaries we've got coming by. He said, your church is special. Said, you've started supporting us when we were very first on the deputation. He said, you've been more than gracious to us. He thanked us for the Christmas offerings that he received. And so I think that he's going to be here next month. And we got two missionaries. That make us two missionaries. And Brother Knapp, I think you're going to be preaching right in the middle. I haven't asked you yet, but I will. And also, I'm going to be finishing up this study on Jeremiah. I'm going to I've read through some passages on it, and I'm just going to conclude because so much in Jeremiah is repetitious. And I want to just try to bring it up to date, and then we'll have a couple of lessons out of Lamentations. And then Brother, what's his name back there? Brother Risk will come into a lesson. He said, how many weeks would you like for me to teach? I said 25 or 30 would be all right. I don't think he's going to do that, but we're looking forward because he's a blessing to us when he does. Wait for God's time is our lesson here today. And it's a history of the siege of the fall of Jerusalem. Because basically the whole book of Jeremiah hinges around the ultimate fall of the city of Jerusalem prior to going into the 70 years of captivity. And so it becomes a little repetitious in some areas, but it also encloses a lot of great truths that we have been rejoicing in. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar went to Jerusalem 3 times. I've found that that's a fact that some Bible students don't ever really recognize. That it wasn't just one siege of the city of Jerusalem. It was actually 3 sieges. And they took away captives in the conflicts. There was Josiah's son in 605. They took away Daniel and some of the other top noblemen that were becoming popular, or becoming, shall we say, authorities or powers in Babylon and in the Chaldea, which it later became. Then in 597 BC, the king of Judah, Jehoshaphat, also Kajana, was taken captive along with many of the top skilled artisans and craftsmen. You know, they began to just really spoil the nation of Israel. They were also put under shall we say, a tribute that was really involved. In fact, the reason that the 3rd siege of Jerusalem came about is because Jehoiakim was simply refused to pay that tribute. He thought he had had some help from the king of Egypt, but it didn't come through in time. So it takes the captive along with many top skilled laborers. In the 3rd and final assault, 586 BC, which ended with well, I'll tell you, I should have checked this a little closer. The Jews were carried into captivity. It was here that we are told Zedekiah and his sons were blinded and slain right before his eyes. We are also told here in 2 Kings 25, 6 and 7, after being brought to Riblah. Now, that is where Nebuchadnezzar had set up his throne, and one of his generals was really in charge of the siege of Jerusalem. And so there they were taken up and they were blinded and they were slain. The only exceptions that they didn't take out, they didn't even bother with, were just simply the poor, the handicapped, and we studied a couple of weeks ago why Jeremiah was left, because he was spared by direct order by Nebuchadnezzar, because he was sometimes thought by the opposition to be a spy before Nebuchadnezzar, before the city of Babylon. But we find that they didn't bother taking these. these would eventually, that were able to make the trip, most of them that were left behind, is what out of the sources I've read, most of them were not able to make the trip. Where down? That's a long trip down over what the Gaza Strip where we have today, and across the desert, and across the Nile to Egypt. So most of them died, but Jeremiah was one that went there, and he did some writing. And it's, as I understand it, it was in the tomb of, or in the library at Alexander. But they do not have a tracing of exactly what it was. But now the passage that we're dealing with today, it's called Settled In, because the background is verse 29, 1 through 3, if you'd like to open your Bibles to read along with us as we study it. In Jeremiah 29, 1 through 3, it says, "Now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem unto the residue of the elders that were carried away captives." Now, Jeremiah, as you know, he was actually through all three sieges of the city of Jerusalem, and he stayed there. And so he begins then to minister God's word, because even in the midst of the fall, the second siege and the third siege, he was given orders from the Lord to talk to the captivities that had been Daniel and the others that we had already discussed, that became really quite popular, quite strong in some of the courts of Nebuchadnezzar. But the elders were carried away captive to the priests and to the prophets, to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had carried away captive from Jerusalem. So these were the words of the letter. So not only was he trying to minister God's word in a city constantly under siege or under tribute to Nebuchadnezzar, but we also says that God said, "I have a message for my people that are undergoing my punishment, that have been carried away already into Babylon and are captives." And after Jeconiah, the king and the queen and the eunuchs and the princes of Judah and the carpenters and the smiths were departed from Jerusalem. In other words, they were there already. And, they were simply exiles, so to speak, or captives, so to speak. They were taken for their talents, they were taken for their skills, but by and large they were a captive people, and they were basically slaves, and thus they were elevated to positions by the rulers in Babylon. And he said, by the hand of Elisha, the son of Shaphan, and Uriah, the son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent into Babylon to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of saying this. He said, "The God is sovereign." Now he starts out with his letter. He's intent in saying to these that are out, he's saying to them, settle in the country where you're captive. In other words, he had told them previously that the captivity would be 70 years, which really indicates the fact that there were probably 2 generations of Israel that were not going to be back to the land, because we didn't have lifespans like we have them today, 45, 50, most of them even younger. And so he said, you need to settle in. By hand of Elisha, Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, as they sent to Babylon, saying this, God is sovereign. That's the whole concept that we begin to build in to this passage. Jeremiah 29:4. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, unto all that are carried away captives, whom I have caused to be carried away from Jerusalem unto Babylon. Well, this letter here shows the love of God for his people. Even though they were in revolt against him, even though they had sacrilegiously gone to other idols, they were absolutely, totally away from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were completely away from the lineage of David, which was the kings under which they were operating. So what we find is that God is teaching us how to wait. I don't know that I should be teaching you this particular lesson, because I'm a lousy waiter. I mean, I want it done yesterday. I've always been that way. My staff that I had where I pastored before, they said, preacher, you want it done yesterday. And By the time I left there, I pretty well had them trained to do it yesterday. But if I make a story, but it's the impatience, God's sovereignty. In other words, he is trying to convey to them that he's still their God, that he is a sovereign Lord over them. He's trying to convey to them that what has happened to them is because of their sin against him, but he has not cast them out. They still belong to him. They're still the children of promise. So it's sovereign over. 1 Chronicles 29:11 says this, Thine, O Lord, is the greatness, the power, the glory, the victory, and the majesty. For all that is in heaven and in the earth is thine. Thine is the kingdom, O Lord. Thou art exalted, head above all. So you imagine the thoughts and perhaps some of these that were carried away. You know, we say the same thing today. Probably Daniel and some of the young men that were carried away. Why me, Lord? Why is this happening to me? Why have I been chosen to go into exile, go into the hands of a tyrant like Nebuchadnezzar and be forced into service of Nebuchadnezzar? So the thing of it is, we've got to remember that regardless of what God places in our path or what path God places for us to walk, he is still sovereign. We have only a responsibility to obey him, not to fuss and argue. But don't we fuss and argue sometimes about the will of God when things happen? We say, well, I don't like the way this is going, or I don't think this is quite the way it ought to be. You know, we predetermine some things, but he's a sovereign over the world, Deuteronomy 4:39. Know therefore this day and consider it in thine heart that the Lord, he is God in heaven above and upon the earth and beneath, and there is no one else. You know, that's a point that we should really take to heart as Christians. Our God's sovereign, but our God is knowledgeable of us. These people that were carried off into captivity, they probably thought everything was gone. They probably thought that no God, as far as they were concerned, God wasn't a God that answered. Why doesn't God answer my prayers? I imagine that when they were carried off, they said, God, I don't want to go. I don't want to do this. I don't like this lot. But God is telling them that he said, I haven't forgotten you. You are going because some of you are punishments, some of them are circumstances that God used in planning the future. But we are his chosen. Ezekiel 22:14-16 says this, Can thine heart endure, or can thy hands be strong in the days that I will deal with thee? What is this? Another prophet saying this. He said, Can thy heart endure, or can thy hands be strong in the days that I shall deal with thee? I, the Lord, have spoken it, and I'll do it. Now, whether or not the average person in Israel understood the 70 years of captivity, they should have, is the message of the prophets of God. Is in the early testimony, and God would have warned by other prophets that if they didn't straighten up, that they were going to be faced with the wrath of Almighty God. So he said, I'll deal with thee. I, the Lord, have spoken it, and I will do it. And I will scatter thee among the heathen, disperse thee in the countries, and I will consume thy filthiness out of thee. In other words, what? He says, I'm putting you there to clean you up. I'm putting you there because you've gotten so dirty in my service. You've gone to other gods and other idols. You've not honored me, nor have you honored my word. So God said, I put you there, and he said, I'm going to consume the filthiness out of you. What's going to consume the filthy? The grief and the heartache of being slaves in a foreign country. Sometimes we read of those that gain positions of notoriety, but it said in verse 16, And thou shalt take thine inheritance in thyself in the sight of the heathen, and thou shalt know that I am the Lord. He says, realize within you that you do belong to the Lord, that you are God's children. He says, inheritance in thyself. You know, the Jew, even in the final casting away after the fall of Jerusalem, the Jew never lost his identity. Didn't matter where he was, what country he was in. He was despised and hated. He was victimized constantly, but he never forgot the fact that he was a Jew. And he never forgot the fact that the God of the Jews was Jehovah God. So we need to understand. So we're waiting on God's time. Now, God's message to those already in captivity, he goes on. He say, here's what he said. Build ye houses and dwell in them. He said, life needs to go on for you, even though you're in captivity. He said, build ye houses and dwell in them. Plant gardens and eat of the fruit of them. Take ye wives and beget sons and daughters. You know, that was a difficult proposition for the Jew because they were not supposed to marry outside the Jewish race. But we know that some of them did. They married among the heathen. The heathen married into some of them. He said, take ye wives, beget sons and daughters, and take wives of your sons and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters, that ye may be increased there and not diminished. He said, I want you to grow. He said, even though you're in captivity, I want to see the people, my people, flourish. And you know, God made it to flourish. Look at back in the history of the books, Daniel, men like that, they rose to prominence even among their captives. So he says, I want you to flourish. He said, pray unto the Lord. Oh, where did I lost my place? Seek peace of the city, whether I have caused you to be carried away captive. Pray unto the Lord for in the peace thereof you shall have peace. He said, you may lament that you're no longer in the land promised you by God. But he said, for peace in thereof you shall have peace. God brought a certain patience to his children while they were in captivity. Some of them, no doubt, by the way that they were influenced by leaders around them, probably they were better off than any captives probably ever existed, because some of them came counselors to kings, counselors to the authorities of the land. So beware of false prophets. Now, consider this. He said this. He said, for thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, let not your prophets and your diviners that be in the midst of you deceive you, neither hearken to your dreams which ye cause to be dreamed, for let the prophesy falsely unto you in my name. I have not sent them, saith the Lord. In other words, some of the crowd that got hauled away were the same false prophets that were causing Jerusalem all their problems to start with. And they, in all probability, were like prophets for hire. They wanted to maintain their position, and even though there's somewhere or another they tried to speak for the Lord, but they were prophets and diviners, and we've already encountered in Israel, a lot of them were not true prophets. A lot of them were not true diviners, but they were also carried away in the captivity, and there's no reason for us to assume that they no longer followed their practices. So what we have is a promised return, because what he's really saying here to his people in captivity, it's temporary. You are going to be brought back. Now, not that first generation, nor in all probability the second, but probably some in the third generation of the captivity were those that came back. Only about 20,000 of them came in the first return to the land. But Jeremiah 29:10-11 says this, for thus saith the Lord, that after 70 years shall be accomplished. He's telling them, you got 70 years to settle down. You got 70 years to marry. You got 70 years to raise my people, because he said, I want you to understand. He said, after the 70 years be accomplished at Babylon, I will visit you. You know, that's something. He said, I will visit you. In other words, all the time they were in captivity, God basically only spoke through a few of his people, only a few of his key people. But he said, I'll visit you. He said, and I will perform my good word towards you in causing you to return from this place. Think about it. When they approached the kings, they were slaves to the king, they were servants to the king, and yet God in some way or another touched the heart of those kings that suddenly this despised people, the Jew, were allowed to come home. One of the greatest dictators of his time, the Chaldean princes, they'll let him go. One of them was a cupbearer to the king, and he lamented before the king about the plight of his people. And the king heeded him and let him go. He promised the king, he said, I'll go, but I'll come back. And so he did that. He kept his word. He came back. But the thing of this, he said, causing you to return to this place, for I know the thoughts that I think toward you. That's a tremendous statement. God says, I know the thoughts that I think toward you. All the thoughts of God toward his people were good. They were not necessarily good things. The problems they had, the crises they came to, were not very pleasing, but the thinking of God was always good toward his people. In fact, I think that indicates more than anything else. Because he said, the thoughts I think toward you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not evil. You know, that really speaks to the forgiveness of God. Now, it took 70 years for this graciousness of God to begin to manifest itself in the people of slavery. I would imagine there's a generation said, we're not going to go home, and you know what? That generation was right. Probably another set of generations said, God says he'll take us home, but I don't think we'll make it with that generation in white. But in that third generation, suddenly it began to materialize that God did love them and that God was going to bring them out of that captivity. Jeremiah 29, verses 12 through 15. Then shall ye call upon me, and ye shall go and pray unto me, and I will hearken unto you. One of the greatest stories in the Bible is Daniel. When they passed a law, said you cannot pray to any other god than the God of the land where he was interred or was a prophet, was a counselor. It said that he did as he usually did, that he could make no prayer to anyone except the king. But he went, opened his windows, faced toward Jerusalem, and prayed 3 times a day. And what did he get out of it? A trip to the lion's den. But what did the lion's den bring him? Victory. He was, God's angel came and shut the mouths of the lions. So ye shall search for me with all your heart. And you seek me and you'll find me when you search for me with all my heart. Well, God is saying, I want you then to think about the promises I've made you. Think about me. Think about once what was for Israel and for Judah in particular. He said, and when you seek me and find me and you search for me with your heart, and I will be found of you, saith the Lord. What does it mean to be found of you? I think it simply means that God will begin to answer your prayers. I think it just makes a new heart. Create a clean heart in me, O Lord. I think that really begins to take place when the captives, probably some of them had the testimony of the 70 years of captivity. Probably some of them didn't know what was going on. You know, we have that today, don't we? Some, you don't know what's going on. But he said, I will be found of you, saith the Lord. I will turn away your captivity. He says, I'm going to bring you out of captivity. I will gather you from all the nations. Now think about that with me, if you will. All the nations. They weren't just transported to one area. They were transported all over the kingdom of Babylon, which now includes up into Turkey, over into Afghanistan, over into Saudi Arabia, over the Tigris River. They were dispersed, and they weren't allowed to practice their worship. Nothing is going on. He said, but I will found of you, and I will gather you from all the nations and from all the places whither I have driven you, saith the Lord, and I'll bring you again to the place whence I caused you to be carried away captive. That's an astounding promise. Because who could keep track of literally millions of people that were driven out of their homelands? Many of them is nothing more than slaves. All of them to start with at that particular capacity. And they were deliberately dispersed. Because not only did they drive them out of their land, but they brought these strangers into the land, different strangers from that land, and took over their land for them. He says, so what? I will bring you into the place which I caused you to be carried away captive. He said, I'm going to give you your land back. That's quite a promise. how that must have encouraged those that were concerned enough about God to consider the things of the Lord, but they did. So principles for waiting. One was trust God's sovereignty. Second is wait on God. Well, they waited 70 years on God before he began to fulfill that which was his responsibility. So God had a plan to restore his chosen. However, with them and us as well, we are not the most patient of people, are we? We get very impatient about some of the things. But sometimes patience is required to see the end that God has chosen for all of his children. Sometimes God will, as we say, exercise your patience. In other words, say, stretch your patience. That happens sometimes. Ecclesiastes 7:8 says, better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. To learn how to be patient. Now, I can use this lesson myself because I'm not the most patient man in the world, but I've learned patience. And Brother Knapp, haven't you learned some patience from time to time? We don't like it. You're about right. That's about what we've got, that much. But that's what God is talking to him about. He says, we of grace are told to be patient, for God has a plan for us, just like he did for Israel. James 5:7-8. Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Well, I get impatient because I want my Lord to come back. I had a funeral today. I told those that were gathered at the graveside under that tent with the rain pouring down, I said, he will come back. And I thought in my heart, even as I said that to the few that gathered there in the rain, I wish it was now. I was impatient. God will come in his own due season. He said, patient therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman waited for the precious fruit of the earth, and hath long patience for it, until he receive the early and the latter rain. Be ye also patient, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. It's probably in the process kind of a farmer, to be patient. My dad planted a victory garden, and he was gone most of the time. He said, you take care of my victory garden. So I would go out to that victory garden, and I'd say, there ain't nothing happening here. No, I'd say, I was impatient. I thought when you grew a tomato, you put it in the ground, next day, it's up. And it doesn't work there. It was patience. So I patiently waited. My dad would come in occasionally from the wells, and he would say, how's my garden doing? And I said, well, it's got some little red things. And I said, like my daughter said, we had a garden for our kindergarten. And my wife, told my daughter, said, go up there, that's when she was real little, go up there and get some radishes. And so my daughter trotted off doodly up there, and then pretty soon she come back. She said, there's no radishes up there. My wife said, oh yes, there's got to be. She said, there is no radishes up there, Mom. So my wife patiently went up there just to see why there wasn't any radishes. So she walked over there and she pulled up, up one. My daughter said, well, you didn't tell me they were underground. So it's important that we really know some of those things. But anyway, I'm so far off the base here. Anyway, be ye also patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. So God's displeasure with those who would forsake their heritage while in captivity. The letter was also to them that those elite of the first two groups carried away were not to be spared the promised wrath of God. 70 years, I think that's why God said 70 years. 2 generations, because most of the lifespan was not as we know it today. 29 in that same chapter, verse 15, 16. Because you have said, the Lord hath raised us up prophets in Babylon. Yes, there were some good prophets, Daniel and some of the others that were in the captivity. He said, because he has raised us up prophets in Babylon. Followers of the same lying prophets is here what he's talking about. These prophets that went with the captivity, they didn't change their ways. They still profited for gain, or prophesied for gain. They still were more interested in self than they were of the will of God. So he said, and thus saith the Lord of the king that sitteth upon the throne of David, and of all the people that dwelleth in this city, and of you, brethren, that are not yet gone forth into captivity. So he closes this letter and says to you, now the rest of you, you need to understand something. You're going to go into captivity. Your king, Hezekiah, might think that he can defeat the armies of Nebuchadnezzar, but he's not. You that are still here and listen to your false prophet to tell you God is going to intercede and we're not going to have to be carried away, what he is simply saying is to you that dwell in the city, my brethren, are not yet gone forth into captivity. He said to them, is any wonder that they didn't like the prophet? He said, you're going into captivity. They're fighting for their life on the walls. They're trying to turn back the armies of Nebuchadnezzar, the hordes that attacked him. And here's this prophet standing in the middle of them, says, you're going to fail. You're going to be carried away into captivity. Any wonder that they threw him in a dungeon with slime up to the armpits. They didn't have much use for him. You say, well, why didn't they kill him? Well, he did have a following, but also remember this. He had God on his side. Remember the first chapter of Jeremiah? He said, they won't listen to you, they won't like you, they'll hate you, and they'll despise you, but I will be with you. And that's a great start in its own right. When you're something with God, God's always successful. Jeremiah 29:17-18, thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold, I will send upon them the sword, the famine, the pestilence, and I will make them like vile figs. They cannot be eaten. They are so evil. So many of the Jews, even in the lands, with the few exceptions I've mentioned, like those that rose to places of prominence, the Jew was hated. The Jew has always been hated when he's not in his land. He's always been despised when he's not in his land. When they were scattered in the diaspora into other countries, the Jew was despised and hated. Many of them were just for no reason at all other than the fact that they were Jewish and they didn't match the citizenship of the country. They'd burn them at the stake. And yet they were successful. God would bless his people in those foreign lands. So he said here, I will send upon them the sword, the famine, the pestilence, and they'll be like vile figs. In other words, no one wanted to be around or eat a vile fig. It was already rotten. But he said, I'll make them. That cannot be eaten. They are so evil. And I will persecute them with the sword, and with famine, with the pestilence, and I will deliver them to be removed from all kingdoms. In other words, they're scattered. Not every Jew sat down in captivity and said, 70 years we're going back. They scattered. They were in all over, as I said today. It wasn't long till they were across the Aegean. It went right over into Greece and over into the Roman Empire, which was just now beginning to blossom. Because they were going out of slavery, out of Nebuchadnezzar and out of the Chaldeans, and they were going to go under slavery again in just a matter of generations under the Roman Empire, the rule of the Roman Empire. So, of course, he said, to be all the kingdoms on earth be a curse, an astonishment, and a hissing, and a reproach among all the nations whither I have driven them. And that was the lot to the Jewish people until God, in 1948, the Balfour Agreement began to take them home. And you know what? They're still not liked. We're changing the attitude of the United States, the government of the United States against the Jew. I mean, when you have the leader of the Jewish people that our president won't sit down with, why? Well, it's part of what God's prophecy is. It's just all it's part of God's prophecy. So trust His sovereignty, wait on God, leave tomorrow in God's hands. Lamentations 3. I don't recognize that particular scripture, but it's verse 22 to 25. I like the little space there. I don't mean wasn't supposed to be there. It is of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed, because His compassions fail not. They're new every morning, great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore I hope in Him. The Lord is good, and unto them that wait on Him, to the soul that seeketh. So the conclusion of Jeremiah's letter was this. I I'll tell you what. Read verses 29, 19 through 24. I didn't realize the time had slipped up on me like that. So take it home. Do your homework, okay? Read the lesson. All right. God's time. Check your heart attitude. Proverbs 4:23. Keep the heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. And so there it is, all it. The principles of waiting. Trust God's sovereignty. Wait on God. Leave tomorrow in God's hand. Check your heart aptitude and avoid self-deception. And the lesson is